October 25, 1942, morning over Rabaul. The sky was clear, sharp blue from horizon to horizon, interrupted only by the occasional vapor trail of a reconnaissance plane or a fighter on patrol. Below, on the tarmac of Lakanai Airfield, laughter echoed in bursts between the hangars and jungle-covered hills. First Lieutenant Shinsuke Ito, a veteran of Formosa and the Philippines, squatted beside his Nakajima Kai-43 Hayabusa and read aloud from a captured U.S. intelligence leaflet, crumpled and smudged with oil. Boeing B Flying Fortress, 4-engine high-altitude strategic bomber, 12 machine guns, 5,000-pound payload. He glanced up at the other pilots. They forgot to mention, turns like a pig, can't dive and can't outrun anything. The laughter doubled. "We should send a fruit basket to Boeing," one pilot called. "Thanks for delivering such easy targets." "They're slow, they're heavy. They die like bricks," Shinsuke said. "I'd rather fight 10 fortresses than one wildcat." He tossed the leaflet into the dirt, stood, and adjusted his flight harness. None of them noticed the faint, low rumble rolling in from the sea. Not thunder, not engines. Just a strange, sustained pressure in the air, barely audible, like the hum of something immense, still too distant to grasp. The morning patrol launched with casual confidence, 6 Hayabusas climbing into the sunlight like dragonflies above the jungle. They carried standard loads, 2 12.7 machine guns, no armor, no radios between aircraft. They didn't expect to need them. 2 hours later, no one was laughing. The first signal came from a ground observer post near Cape St. George. Unknown formation inbound, multiple aircraft, estimated altitude 9,000 meters, heading direct toward Rabaul. The transmission hissed with static, then silence. Minutes later, Lakanai's air warning center went dead as a transmission cut off mid-sentence. By the time radar confirmed the size of the force, it was already too late. High above the Solomon Sea, 27 B-17s of the U.S. Army Air Forces swept in from the southeast, formation tight, engines synchronized. They had taken off from Espiritu Santo before dawn, refueled at Henderson, and now roared toward Rabaul with a payload designed not to wound, but to annihilate. Each flying fortress carried a 4,000-pound bomb load, supported by 5 crewman defensive gun positions. 12.50 caliber machine guns encircled every aircraft, 2 waist gunners, a tail gunner, a ball turret, a top turret, and a chin turret. Every direction except down was covered in firepower. At altitude, the fortresses looked like silver phantoms. But when sunlight caught their bellies, the ground crews at Rabaul saw the glint of America's war machine in full flight. The roar reached Lakanai before the bombs did. Ground crews scrambled, shouting. Sirens wailed across the jungle, stalling and echoing in panicked bursts. Anti-aircraft guns spun skyward but found nothing. The bombers were too high, out of reach. Shinsuke, still airborne, heard it first, a low, growing wall of thunder. He turned, squinting into the east. Then he saw them. Not a few, not a dozen. Nearly 30 giant aircraft, flying in staggered box formation, stacked in tiers like stairs into the heavens. They weren't diving, they weren't maneuvering. They were simply coming, slow, methodical, like an avalanche. He called to his wingman, "Gyro, do you see it?" Gyro's voice crackled back, "Kami-sama, they're everywhere." For the first time in his combat career, Shinsuke hesitated. This wasn't a bombing raid, it was a demonstration. The formation had mass, weight, presence, like an army moving through the sky. And then the bay doors opened. Thousands of meters above Rabaul, the bellies of the fortresses yawned open, and the payload began to fall. The bombs did whistle like they did in movies. There was no elegant note of descent, only a sound like the tearing of the earth itself, a low, mechanical shriek that grew louder as the sky rained fire. Within seconds, the jungle erupted. The first bombs hit the eastern edge of the airfield. Fuel depots vaporized. Shockwaves flattened palm trees. Barracks turned to firestorms in a single heartbeat. Then came the second wave. Runways cracked open like ribs. Hangars collapsed in sheets of twisted aluminum and flame. Anti-aircraft crews vanished under fountains of earth and smoke. And still the fortresses came. Shinsuke dove into the formation, teeth gritted, throttle to the limit. His Hayabusa rattled as he passed through the flak smoke, and then the air lit up with tracers. He banked left. A fortress tail gunner saw him. The .50 cal rounds tore across his canopy, punching holes through wing fabric and steel. Gyro followed in behind, trying to swing low across the bomber's underbellies. Two fortresses turned in unison. Waist gunners opened fire, and Gyro's Hayabusa disintegrated midair, wings separating from the fuselage in a flaming spiral. Shinsuke screamed but couldn't hear his own voice. His cockpit was filled with smoke, warning lights flashing. He pulled away, bleeding altitude, and looked back. The fortresses hadn't broken formation. They hadn't flinched. He had grown up believing that aircraft were either fast or armored, never both. That to attack meant to be exposed. That to strike from above meant you gave up defense. But the fortresses had rewritten the equation. They weren't just bombers, they were machines of defiance. Flying in tight formations, they overlapped their firepower, making each group a floating fortress in the truest sense. Attack one, and 5 others would shoot you down. Shinsuke reached base on fumes. Smoke blanketed the runway. Craters made landing suicidal. He skidded into a clearing, bracing for fire. None came, because there was no airfield left to defend it. From the jungle, survivors emerged in silence. No one spoke. No one had seen anything like it. Later that night, Shinsuke sat beneath the black canopy of the jungle sky, the stars hidden by smoke. He cleaned his pistol without thinking, hands moving on instinct. He could still hear the rhythm of the fortresses, the deep, overlapping hum of 4-engine squadrons, the sound of the world changing. He had mocked them once. He would never laugh again. The next morning, his squadron received orders for a new doctrine: engage fortresses with at least 4 fighters at once. Never attack alone. Never come head-on. Focus on engine fire. Disengage if tail gunners sight you. Shinsuke folded the orders. He didn't need them. He already knew. The flying fortresses had not come to duel. They had come to dominate. And Rabaul had been the first to understand. By the 3rd week of November, the legend had spread. The flying fortresses weren't just feared in the air. They were spoken of with unease in command tents, with dread in maintenance shacks, and with bitterness in intelligence briefings. At Tobra, north of Rabaul, Captain Saburo Nishida reviewed the after-action reports with a cigarette trembling between his fingers. A veteran of Rangoon, Singapore, and Java, he had shot down wildcats and bombers, evaded hurricanes of flak, and flown through typhoons. But nothing he read prepared him for the facts in front of him. 3 entire fighter squadrons had engaged the fortresses over Rabaul. Only 9 aircraft returned. 7 of those were damaged. 3 had been shot down from behind, not by enemy fighters but by gunners. He skimmed the field notes. Concentrated tail fire, impossible to approach from rear. Top turret gunner tracked perfectly through dive, pilot killed. 2 fighters attempted head-on pass, both destroyed by nose gun. He leaned back in his folding chair and muttered, "It's not a bomber, it's a wall." His intelligence officer, Lieutenant Morimoto, stepped forward, quietly placing new photographs on the table. Aerial recon images of Espiritu Santo. More fortresses, more rows of them, dozens. Nishida stared. They're mass-producing them. Morimoto nodded. With American methods, full assembly lines, they call it Detroit bombing doctrine. Bombs by industry delivered by machines. Nishida crushed his cigarette and stood. Then we must learn how to kill machines. But even as he said it, he wasn't sure that was possible anymore. 1,000 miles away, in the Solomon Islands, the fortresses returned. It was the second raid on Munda Point airfield, not large, not strategically vital, but the Americans bombed it anyway. Not to win territory, to make a point. They came again in formation. 22 aircraft, high and unwavering, engines humming in synchrony. This time, Japanese Air Command was ready. 4 squadrons of interceptors launched from Kahili and Vila, Zeros, Hayabuses, even a few outdated Kai-27s, 47 aircraft in total. They climbed in staggered echelons, aiming to flank the fortresses from all angles. Shinsuke Ito flew among them, eyes fixed on the formation above. The smoke from Rabaul had barely cleared from his lungs, but he was back in the air, chasing ghosts with metal teeth. His wingman, Lieutenant Kuroda, called over the radio, "They're not even maneuvering." Shinsuke grunted, "They don't have to." He remembered Rabaul, the overlapping arcs of fire, the impossibility of surprise, the way Jero had simply vanished under a sheet of tracers. This time, he'd try something different. As the Zeros began their first pass, Shinsuke peeled off and climbed, higher, above the fortresses. His idea was simple: drop from above, attack blind spots, escape through the cloud. But when he leveled out and lined up for the attack, he saw the truth. There were no blind spots. One fortress banked gently, its top turret locked onto him before he even began his dive. A stream of .50 cal tracers reached up like fingers trying to pluck him from the sky. He rolled, felt rounds punch through his fuselage. A control cable snapped. His starboard aileron froze. He fired anyway. Cannon rounds struck the left wing of one B-17. Smoke trailed behind it. One engine sputtered, but the plane didn't fall. 2 other fortresses shifted formation to protect it. Their guns roared, overlapping fire lashing out at him like a snare. Shinsuke barely escaped with his aircraft intact. Back at base, they counted the cost. Out of 47 Japanese planes, 23 were lost, 9 pilots wounded, 4 confirmed kills. But none of the kills were fortresses. They had shot down 2 P-39s and 2 P-38 escorts. All 22 B-17s returned home. That night at Kahili, the pilots gathered in silence around a barrel fire. The mood was raw, stripped of ego. Kuroda leaned against the wing of his battered Zero, staring into the flames. "I put 2 bursts into one. Full cannon, he just kept flying." Shinsuke nodded. "They're not fast, they're not agile, but they don't break." Lieutenant Masaru, the youngest of them, asked quietly, "What do we do then, if we can't outfly them and we can't outgun them?" Nobody answered. Because the truth sat heavy on every tongue, unspeakable but undeniable. The old rules were gone. In Rangoon, in Malaya and the Philippines, the Japanese had swept the skies with lighter, faster, more maneuverable fighters. One-on-one, in skill and daring, they believed no one could match them. But these weren't duels. These were storms, and they were flying on wings made in America. 3 days later, a new strategy was tested. 8 Kai-43s were grouped in tight formation and ordered to focus on a single fortress, attack from above, one direction, one pass. The plan was precise. They would fire all weapons at once, aim for cockpit and wings and peel away, kill one plane, break the spell. The result was catastrophic. The fortresses saw them coming, adjusted altitude, shifted formation. As the Hayabuses dove, the fortresses opened fire in sync. 2 attackers were destroyed before they reached range. 3 more pulled out of formation with shredded wings. Only 1 pilot managed to release a full burst. The targeted B-17 smoked, dipped, and then leveled out, its crew sealing off the damage, continuing the mission. All 8 Japanese fighters returned damaged. None of them claimed a kill. The psychological effect was immediate. From Tokyo to Truk, Imperial Army Air Service officers began revising manuals. Interception guidelines were withdrawn. Dogfighting tactics were set aside. Now the focus was pure numbers. If you saw fortresses, you didn't engage unless you had at least 12 fighters. You didn't engage unless they were returning from target, low on bombs and fuel. You didn't engage unless you could attack from altitude, with surprise in numbers. And even then, you were lucky if one fell. Back at Espiritu Santo, the Americans knew what was happening. Briefing officers handed out new intelligence reports. The Japanese were adapting and would no longer treat the fortresses as weak. But by then, it didn't matter. Because by then, the production had scaled. The 11th Bombardment Group was joined by the 5th, then the 307th, then the 43rd. By early 1943, the U.S. had deployed over 400 B-17s across the Pacific. Airfields were built, runways extended, bomb racks doubled. Every fortress carried not just bombs and gunners, but message and myth. They came by day. They didn't run. They didn't hide. And wherever they flew, they left fire behind them. Shinsuke watched them again in March from the hills near Wewak. He had been grounded with injuries, ribs broken from a flak burst, arm in a sling. He saw the fortresses crest the ridgeline in waves, blackening the sky. No escort fighters. They didn't need them. Below, the earth shook, the jungle boiled, the buildings vanished. And above it all, the fortresses flew on, like gods deaf to bullets, blind to fear. He bowed his head, unable to look any more. He had flown against them, he had fired on them, he had bled to stop them. And they were still coming. He knew then what most Japanese commanders refused to say. The fortresses weren't invincible, but they were inevitable. And they had come to stay. By mid-1943, the B-17 was no longer a rumor. It had become a ritual. Every dawn raid on a Pacific outpost began the same way, the low, distant hum rising out of the sea mist. The jungle birds would go silent. Ground crews would freeze, eyes lifted. And then, inevitably, the fortresses would appear, not 1 or 2, but whole squadrons, silver wings lined in formation, their shadows dragging across the ridgelines like gods approaching judgment. At Wewak, at Lee, at Salamoa, the same pattern repeated. Heavy bomb load, high altitude, tight formations, overlapping arcs of fire. Then came the deluge. The Japanese called it rain from the iron sky. For the men on the ground, it was no longer just about dodging bombs. It was about enduring helplessness. Their flak batteries reached 22,000 feet at best. The fortresses flew above 25,000. The machine guns pointed skyward, sputtered, and stopped. The jungle shook, but the sky was never harmed. Lieutenant Hiroshi Kawamura, stationed outside Hollandia, watched an entire ammo depot vanish under a single pass. The bombs didn't scatter, they walked, one after the other, down a precise line like a blade slicing through paper. He didn't speak for an hour afterward. The depot had taken 6 months to build. The fortresses erased it in under 90 seconds. Back in Tokyo, frustration turned into desperation. Reports poured in from the field. High-altitude bombers evading interception. Fortress squadrons unbroken despite multiple fighter sorties. Morale deteriorating across forward units. One general suggested suicide attacks against the bomber formations. Another proposed retrofitting aircraft with upward-firing cannons, an idea eventually tested but too late to change anything. Meanwhile, the Americans kept refining their doctrine. By the end of 1943, fortress raids had increased in size and precision. New formations practiced tighter combat boxes, with each aircraft's fields of fire carefully mapped. Radio coordination allowed mid-air adjustment. More dangerously, they started coordinating with the P-38 Lightnings, long-range escorts that now roamed the Pacific like wolves beside giants. Shinsuke Ito, now grounded with a chest wound from a tail gunner's burst near Kavieng, listened from a hospital cot as younger pilots discussed their first encounters with the fortresses. "They're slow," one said, "but they don't care. They flew through flak like it was wind. They didn't even swerve when we hit their wing." He recognized the tone. It was what he had felt after Rabaul. Not awe, not fear. Hopelessness. By early 1944, the fortresses reached Truk, the Japanese Gibraltar of the Pacific. The island fortress had been built for years. Massive airfields, dozens of ships, tunnels carved into volcanic rock. Japan's high command believed it could not fall. But they had not accounted for what 36 B-17s could do in a single morning. The fortresses arrived just before sunrise, guided by navigators who had trained over the deserts of Nevada, bombing cardboard towns from 10 miles up. Over the Pacific, they found real targets and they didn't miss. Each wave laid a new scar into the island. Craters overlapped, harbors filled with flaming wreckage. Cruisers moored in sheltered coves erupted into geysers of steel. The airfields vanished under collapsing hangars and fuel fires. By 900 hours, Truk was no longer a fortress. It was ash. And again, not one B-17 was lost. One crew reported minor engine damage. Another had a gunner wounded by a lucky burst of flak. That was all. To the Japanese officers who had believed the island invincible, it was like watching a mountain dissolve in rain. General Takahashi wrote in his report, "We are not fighting an enemy aircraft. We are fighting a steel tide. Our weapons are stones cast at a flood." Across the Pacific, the name Flying Fortress became shorthand for futility. Pilots spoke it with clenched jaws. Ground crews prayed when they heard it. Even veterans who had fought in China, who had bayoneted through Shanghai, climbed through Luzon, swept through the jungle like ghosts, admitted it was different now. One could outwit a man, one could even kill a machine. But the fortresses did not break. They flew with purpose, with planning, with numbers and logic and overwhelming force. There were no emotions behind those squadrons, only production quotas and fuel calculations and steel and rivet faith. And if they lost one, 10 more would come to replace it. That was the part the Japanese couldn't replicate, couldn't understand. It wasn't just the weapon, it was the scale. Factories in Seattle, Wichita, and Long Beach didn't just build aircraft, they built certainty. On the 16th of July, 1944, a turning point arrived. A new class of bomber reached the Pacific, the B-29 Superfortress. Larger, faster, higher. It was the next step in the evolution of air power, but even as it arrived, the B-17s still flew. They had become more than strategy. They were a doctrine, a culture, a tempo of war. And even as the B-29s began striking deeper, into Saipan, then Iwo Jima, then the home islands themselves, the fortresses continued to carve scars across the Pacific belt. Shinsuke saw one again in August, flying alone, damaged, trailing smoke. He was on the ground, a maintenance officer now, his flying days behind him. He heard the engines first, that distinct four-engine rhythm. He looked up. The bomber wobbled but flew steady, even as its wings smoked. One gunner still fired into the jungle, even though no fighters chased them. The plane passed overhead, nose still pointed east, back to base, back to fuel, back to reload. And Shinsuke realized something he had never said aloud, even during his darkest missions. They would never stop. Even if Japan found a way to down 1, or 10, or 100. The fortresses would keep coming. Not because they were invincible, but because America could afford to send more. The sky would fill again. In Tokyo, planners discussed the defense of the mainland. They knew the Americans would come. They imagined divisions of tanks, fleets of ships, and endless waves of infantry. But above it all, what the soldiers feared most was the same thing that had haunted every island before them. Not the bombs, not the battleships, but the hum of distant engines, growing louder, filling the sky, signaling that the fortresses were coming again. And this time, they were bringing the end with them. Over the Marianas, they flew in silence. It was not the silence of stealth, it was the silence of certainty. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses, launched from Tinian and Saipan, gliding in massive box formations toward a new horizon. For years, they had scarred islands, erased bases, silenced fleets. But now, for the first time, they were pointed directly at Japan itself. And nothing would stop them. Colonel Raymond Slayton stood in the narrow passage behind the cockpit, one hand gripping the ceiling rail as his men worked through final checks. The fortress smelled of gun oil, sweat, coffee from a thermos that had long gone cold. The target that morning was Hamamatsu, a key industrial city along the southern coast of Honshu, a place that built airplane propellers, radios, and dreams of resistance. That morning it would burn. Slayton stepped over the spar and peered through the port window. Beyond the wingtip, another fortress flew just 40 yards away. Beyond that, another, and another, a vast grid of war shimmering silver in the early sun. He'd flown these missions since 1942. Rabaul, Wewak, Truk. He'd watched the Empire of Japan lose its grip, one flaming crater at a time. But this was different. They were in Japan's sky now. And no zero, no flak burst, no desperate scramble from a damaged airfield had risen to meet them. The enemy was retreating into caves and bunkers, unable to touch what rumbled high above them. The flying fortress had become a ceiling they could not break. Down below, at a hastily reactivated airfield west of Nagoya, Flight Instructor Captain Takashi Murakami listened to the distant thunder rolling across the sky. He was supposed to be training new cadets that week, boys who had never seen combat, barely 16. They practiced on broken trainers and outdated fighters. Fuel was rationed. Ammunition, even for practice, was precious. When the sound came that low, rising drone, the base commander stepped outside and stared up into the blue. There was no alarm, no scramble. Only watching. Murakami joined him. And then the sky darkened. At first, it looked like a storm bank rolling in from the Pacific. But then, shafts of sunlight broke between the lines. Silver shapes gleamed, layered across the heavens like ordered gods. The commander muttered, "How many are there?" Murakami said nothing. It wasn't a question worth answering, not anymore. Over Hamamatsu, the fortresses opened their bays. The bomb run began. 3 minutes later, the city changed. There was no resistance, no flak, no interceptors. Just glass shattering across the prefecture, roofs lifting like paper, the air itself catching fire, machine shops vanished, rail lines twisted. Workers who had survived years of war simply disappeared into smoke. From 5 miles up it looked clinical, clean, bombs marching forward in perfect lines. One bombardier remarked over intercom, "It's like planting iron seeds." No one replied. By the time the fortresses turned back toward Saipan, the The smoke columns had risen high enough to chase them. They left behind heat, wreckage, shockwaves that wouldn't be measured in rubble but in surrender. At a top-secret underground conference in Tokyo, High Command studied maps in silence. Red circles marked every city the B-17 had reached. Dotted lines projected where they would strike next. A colonel tried to speak but couldn't find the words. They didn't need more explanations. The fortresses had explained everything. General Uchida broke the silence. "They do not come for territory," he said. "They come for time. They are cutting down the hours we have left." Someone else muttered, "The bombs fall like a clock." No one laughed. That night, Murakami walked the wreckage of an airfield outside Yokohama. No one had even tried to save the runway. The fortresses had cratered it beyond repair. Hangars shredded. Planes flipped like toys. The sick were still buried in a collapsed infirmary. Among the debris, he found a student's notebook, pages charred, but a few words still visible. "If I die for the Emperor, I will rise in the next life as wind." He closed it, held it to his chest, and stared at the black horizon. But the wind wasn't Japanese anymore. It came from the east, and it carried thunder. On July 29, 1945, the fortresses came for Aomori. By then, Japanese civilians knew the signs. The sound, the sky growing pale, then silver, then black, the pause before the first explosion. There was no alarm anymore. Cities had no power. Radios fell silent. Aomori vanished in 40 minutes. Then Toyama, then Hachioji. The fortresses moved like chess pieces across the map. It wasn't rage, it wasn't vengeance. It was method. In Tokyo, word spread of the new American bomber, the B-29 superfortress, but it didn't matter. To most, it was just a bigger version of the nightmare they already knew. And for many, for the children, the mothers, the students learning arithmetic in trembling classrooms, the B-17 was the first monster they had ever seen. They didn't call it by its name. They called it the machine that comes with fire. In the final days before Hiroshima, Murakami was ordered to fly one last mission. Not combat, a supply run to Kyushu, dodging craters and bridges bombed into extinction. He flew low. The sky above was empty, no fighters left, no radar alerts, only distant trails of smoke and a sun that felt too close. He passed a village that no longer existed. And then in the distance he saw it. A lone bee turning out to sea. It had been hit, one engine trailing smoke, but it flew on, steady, proud, surrounded by nothing. He didn't raise his radio. He didn't raise his guns. He only watched as it faded into the horizon, steel wings against the sunset. And in his heart he said a prayer not of hate, but of understanding. That plane would not stop. None of them would. Until Japan did. August 5, 1945, Yokota Air Base, Japan. There were no alarms anymore, no sirens. The generator that powered the warning system had failed 3 days prior, and no one had bothered to repair it. Lieutenant Commander Koji Asano sat on a bench just outside the ruined hangar, polishing the barrel of his Nambu pistol in silence. A swarm of flies hovered around a fuel drum nearby. Smoke hung low across the base, crawling across the cracked tarmac like fog searching for something to mourn. The air was too still, too quiet. He had seen what came before that kind of silence. High above, he finally heard it, the sound that had become myth and memory at once. The low growl of 100 synchronized engines, thousands of feet above him. He didn't look up, he didn't need to. B-17s. He knew the sound by heart now, every Japanese officer did. The rhythm of inevitability, each engine a drumbeat, each bomb a heartbeat skipped. No one scrambled. There were no fighters left to launch. The handful of Ki-84s parked along the edge of the airfield hadn't flown in a month. They sat on flat tires, their wings peeling under the summer sun, gathering dust like relics in a forgotten shrine. Asano simply listened. It wasn't fear anymore. That had faded months ago. What he felt now was something harder, something quieter. Resignation. Overhead, the formation moved like a continent through the sky. The 504th Bomb Group had launched from Tinian at dawn, 63 fortresses in staggered box formation. Each carried 4,500 pounds of explosives, a dozen .50 caliber machine guns apiece, gunners at every station. But the guns hadn't fired in days. There was nothing left to shoot at. No interceptors, no flak, no resistance. They flew through empty skies. In the lead ship, Captain Walker adjusted his oxygen mask, leaned forward and gave the order. Bomb doors open. The bays yawned beneath the bellies of the fortresses. Dozens of bombs dropped silently into the void, spinning end over end. They didn't whistle, they didn't scream. But when they landed, the earth roared. Explosions walked across Yokota in perfect spacing, one after another. Ordnance traced straight lines through barracks, mess halls, fuel tanks, runways. What hadn't been destroyed in earlier raids was now erased. Walker watched the mushrooming smoke curl away in the distance and said nothing. This was routine now. A mission, a flight path, a target, a return. There was no challenge, no contest. Only delivery. Asano stood through the entire bombing run, unmoving. When the earth shook beneath his feet, he flinched only once. A final crater tore through the edge of the runway and splashed mud and flame just 30 meters away. He remained standing, unharmed. There was nothing to do. No calls to make, no men to command. This was not a battle. It was an ending. In Hiroshima the next morning, the fortresses didn't come. Something else did. One aircraft, one bomb. It was not a B-17. It was a B-29, sleeker, faster, deadlier. But those who looked up didn't know the difference. All they saw was an American bomber overhead. All they heard was the familiar hum of death with wings. And then they saw the light. From the mountains near Hiroshima, survivors swore the sky opened. The sun dropped to earth. By the time news reached Tokyo, those who still had radios already knew. This was no ordinary bombing. There was no crater pattern, no sequence of explosions, no surviving fire trucks, no structure at all. Just erasure. 2 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki. And yet the fortresses still flew. They weren't needed anymore, not to destroy, not to finish. But they flew because they could, because they had been doing it since 1942, because the message had been delivered long before the bombs had. They flew because by now, even their shadow was enough to empty cities. On August 15, 1945, the Emperor's voice echoed across a battered nation. We have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace. The war was over. On Tinian, on Saipan, on Guam, the fortresses returned to their airfields. Maintenance crews cleaned the barrels of machine guns that hadn't been used in weeks. Mechanics logged flight hours into worn notebooks. Gunners played cards in the shade of wings that had darkened half the Pacific. Captain Walker sat beneath the tail of his B-17, its name painted in flaking white, Heaven's Hammer. He didn't celebrate, he didn't weep. He simply exhaled and said, "That's it." In the ruins of Tokyo, Asano walked through the remnants of an anti-aircraft battery. The barrels pointed skyward still, silent, rusted, blind. He had served from Manchuria to Okinawa. He had watched the empire rise with fanfare and fury. But he knew, as he traced a hand across the mangled shield of a flak gun, that it hadn't been the Americans' rifles or tanks that ended them. It was their sky. And what they put in it. The fortresses had done something no other weapon could. They flew not just through airspace but through thought, through fear, through morale, through doctrine. They redefined combat. They turned resistance into ritual, then ritual into silence. Each mission had a target, but every mission sent a message. You cannot hide. You cannot run. You will not outlast this. The Japanese pilots who had once laughed at the flying fortresses were dead, captured, grounded, or silent. Shinsuke Ito, alive and forgotten, repaired bicycles in Nagano. Sometimes he looked up at the sound of a distant engine, heart thudding. Even now, even years later, the sky still carried ghosts. The last time he saw a fortress, it flew low during a repatriation flight, carrying POWs home. Its wings were still silver, its tail still straight, its guns were covered in canvas. But the hum, that sound was still there. He stopped what he was doing and watched it pass, vanishing beyond the ridge. It hadn't fired a shot. It didn't need to. The war had ended long before the papers were signed. It had ended the day the sky turned silver. And never turned back. September 1945, Yokohama. The war was over. The flags had changed. American soldiers now walked the same piers where Imperial engineers had once loaded Zero fighters onto transports. The harbor, still choked with sunken hulls, groaned under the machinery of surrender. Inside a rust-stained hangar on the edge of what had been the largest naval airbase in Japan, 3 Japanese officers sat around a steel desk stripped of its maps. One man spoke. The others listened. They were answering questions. Not under duress, not with fists or shackles. Just quiet, measured, recorded. One of them, an aging colonel named Tsubaki, tapped his finger against the empty desk. They weren't just machines, he said. They were math, flying mathematics, made of time and fuel and fire. A younger officer, still in blood-stained fatigues, added, "We learned how to shoot them down too late. By the time we figured out how to reach them, we no longer had the fuel to take off." The third, a flight instructor from Yokosuka, muttered, "Their gun crews never panicked. Even when we came head-on, they didn't flinch. They just tracked us." The man recording them didn't interrupt. He just let the silence hang. Tsubaki eventually broke it. "Do you know what we were told when they first appeared? That they were too big, too slow, that no bomber can survive a fighter's teeth." He smiled, not from joy, from disbelief. "That's what we believed, right until the sky turned silver." In Saipan, a different conversation played out. On the tarmac of Isley Field, 2 B-17 crewmen stripped the guns from their aircraft. The war was over. The fortresses would be shipped home or scrapped. Their engines had few hours left. Their wings were patched with sheet metal and prayer. Staff Sergeant Henry Kaplan knelt by the tail gunner's station, his hands running over the rivets. He had sat there over 30 missions, watched the Pacific Arch below him, watched Zeros peel off in flames, watched the sky turn into a cage of tracers and fire. Now the gun was quiet, its belt removed, its mount cold. He didn't speak, not until the lieutenant passed by and asked, "You miss it already?" Kaplan stood, wiped his hands on his trousers. "Not the war," he said, "but the rhythm." "What rhythm?" Kaplan stared off toward the horizon, where the sea met the wreckage of a dozen stripped planes. The hum, the weight, that feeling when you saw the formation ahead of you and it looked like home. Weeks later in Hiroshima, a different kind of silence ruled. There were no fortresses here, no craters in patterns, no careful lines of damage to mark the bomb's passage. Just a shadow, etched into stairs, burned into walls, burned into time. But even here, survivors spoke of them. Not the B-29 that dropped the bomb. The others. The ones that came before. Do you remember, a nurse whispered to her brother as they picked through a half-collapsed shrine, when we saw them over Kobe? You were 9. I told you they looked like stars flying in formation. Her brother nodded. And they never stopped, he said. No, not even once. Back in Tokyo, former Major Hiroshi Kawamura sat with a group of veterans in a wooden hall that had once hosted military briefings. They had gathered to speak of the war, not to glorify, not to accuse, but simply to name it. A few still wore remnants of uniform. Most wore silence like a second skin. When someone asked, what was the beginning of the end, Kawamura didn't hesitate. It wasn't the Marines, it wasn't the bombs. He pointed upward, then closed his fist. It was when the sky stopped belonging to us. Across the Pacific, at a reunion in Kansas, a group of B-17 pilots met for the last time. Men now stooped with age, their voices softened but memories still sharp. They toasted to friends lost over Truk, over New Guinea, over Rabaul. And they spoke of those strange final missions, the ones over cities that never shot back, the ones where they flew through silence. It was never about dropping bombs, one said. Another nodded. It was about showing up, again and again, until the enemy couldn't imagine a world where we didn't. By 1946, most of the B-17s had been retired. Some went to museums. Some were scrapped in airfields across the West. A few became fire bombers, dropping water on forests instead of steel on cities. But their mark had been left, not in ruins, not in smoke, but in memory. They had not been perfect. They had not been invulnerable. But they had rewritten the rules. They had proven that steel, when shaped with purpose, when flown in unity, could turn the sky itself into a weapon. And in doing so, they had broken not just fortresses of concrete and coral, but fortresses of belief. Shinsuke Ito, now an old man with clouded eyes and trembling hands, walked each morning through the remains of an airfield in Nagano Prefecture. The grass had overtaken the runways. The hangars were gone. Only one piece remained. The rusted hulk of a tail boom, marked faintly with white stars. An American fortress, shot down late in the war, crashed in the mountains during a storm. No one recovered the crew. The local villagers buried them near the forest line out of respect, not for the enemy, but for the pilots. Shinsuke passed the wreckage, his hand lightly brushing the old metal. The sky above was empty, and yet he could still hear it. The hum that had never left him. The sound of the sky darkening. Not in shadow, but in certainty.